Clint Eastwood walked onto a live TV set, expecting a fair interview, but Fiona Sterling had other plans. She was ready to embarrass him, to prove he was outdated, irrelevant, and part of a past that needed to be forgotten. Cameras rolled, the audience waited, and Fiona smirked, thinking she had him cornered. But what happened next left her stunned, the internet in shock, and the world talking. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The glow of studio lights bounced off the sleek glass table as producers huddled in the control room, murmuring with electric anticipation. Tonight's episode of the Late Night Spotlight wasn't just another interview. It was a takedown. "We've got everything lined up, right?" Fiona Sterling asked, crossing her arms as she scanned the monitors. She was dressed in a crisp navy suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her red lipstick a deliberate power move. A producer named Greg nodded, flipping through his cue cards. "We'll start off light, but once we get to his westerns, that's where we hit hard. Play up the whole toxic masculinity angle. Make him look like a relic of the past." Another producer, Sarah, smirked. "And if he stumbles, we double down. This is the moment people realize Clint Eastwood isn't some legend. He's outdated." Fiona grinned, adjusting the gold watch on her wrist. This was her moment, the moment she'd prove herself as the next great voice in television, the one who finally knocked Clint Eastwood off his pedestal. "Let's go over the clips one more time," she instructed. The first clip played on the monitor. Eastwood, young and sharp-eyed, gunning down outlaws in the good, the bad, and the ugly. "That's the setup," Greg said. "Then we follow with the modern-day critique. We'll have experts calling it harmful glorification of violence." Fiona chuckled. "Perfect. And then, the knockout punch." The second clip loaded, Eastwood in a decades-old interview, making a blunt political statement. Out of context, it was explosive. "That's the moment," Sarah whispered. "That's when he crumbles." Fiona leaned back in her chair, soaking in the strategy. She had spent weeks preparing for this. She had studied his past interviews, his old remarks, his moments of controversy. She knew every weak spot, every possible misstep he could make. "What if he doesn't stumble?" an intern asked hesitantly. Fiona shot him a look. "He's 94. He will." The producers laughed, nodding in agreement. A stagehand suddenly pushed open the control room door. "He's here," he announced. The room fell silent. On the monitor, a black SUV pulled up outside the studio. The door opened slowly, and from the shadows emerged Clint Eastwood. Dressed in a sharp black blazer and a simple button-down, he moved with deliberate ease. His weathered face held no expression, no nerves, no hesitation. Fiona expected an old man, hunched and frail. Instead, she saw a legend who looked completely unreadable. She swallowed. "All right," she said, forcing a smirk. "Let's give him a show he won't forget." The green room was quiet except for the soft hum of the television mounted on the wall. A blue-tinted glow flickered across Clint Eastwood's face as he sat in a leather chair, his long legs stretched out, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand. His assistant Jack stood near the door, arms crossed, his expression tight with concern. "You sure about this?" Jack asked. "You know what Fiona Sterling does. She does an interview. She ambushes." Clint took a slow sip of coffee, his expression unreadable. "Let her talk," he muttered. Jack sighed. "I did some digging. The producers are setting you up. They've got clips lined up, your movies, old interviews. They want to paint you as out of touch, as some relic of a time that should be forgotten." Clint smirked. "Relics belong in museums. I don't." Jack exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had worked for Clint long enough to know that once he made up his mind, there was no changing it. Still, something about this didn't sit right. "This is different, Clint. They're not looking for a conversation. They want a moment, a headline, a viral clip that makes them look like the next big thing." Clint swirled his coffee absent-mindedly, his weathered fingers tapping against the ceramic mug. "Let me tell you something, kid," Clint said, his voice low but steady. "People like her, they come and go. I've seen them before. She thinks she's got me cornered, but see," he set his mug down gently, "I don't play chess when I walk into a room. I am the board." Jack opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no stopping this. Meanwhile, across the studio, Fiona Sterling sat in front of a mirror, her makeup artist applying the final touches of powder to her sharp, confident features. She scrolled through the notes on her phone, mentally rehearsing her attack. The phrasing had to be perfect. The timing, surgical. She'd start with charm, lure him into a false sense of security, then hit him where it hurt. A young producer leaned in. The audience is packed. Everyone's ready. Fiona flashed a confident smile. Good. This is going to be career-defining. Back in the green room, the air shifted. A firm knock on the door. Clint looked up. A voice from the other side. Mr. Eastwood, it's time. Clint stood, adjusting his blazer. He turned to Jack with a small, knowing grin. Showtime. And with that, he walked toward the spotlight. The stage lights burned bright, casting a golden glow over the glossy black floors. The audience buzzed with anticipation, their whispers mixing with the soft hum of the studio's ambient music. Fiona Sterling sat at her desk, her posture poised, a carefully curated smile painted across her lips. In front of her was the man of the hour, Clint Eastwood. He sat back in his chair, completely at ease, one hand resting lazily on the armrest. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, studied Fiona like a man who had seen 1,000 faces just like hers. The camera's red light blinked on. The show was live. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a legend in the house tonight. Fiona's voice rang out, full of exaggerated excitement. The crowd clapped, some genuinely excited, others just following the energy in the room. She turned to Clint, her expression warm. Too warm. Clint, welcome. It's an absolute honor to have you here. Clint gave a slow nod. Appreciate it. Fiona crossed her legs, folding her hands in her lap. You've had an incredible career. 6 decades in Hollywood. Iconic films. A legacy most actors could only dream of. Clint didn't react, just watching, waiting. Fiona leaned forward slightly, her smile sharpening. But at 94 years old, don't you think it's time to let go of the spotlight? A murmur ran through the audience. Some chuckled, others stiffened. Clint exhaled softly, barely reacting. He tilted his head slightly, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Not surprised, not offended, just amused. Fiona smirked, taking his silence as hesitation. I mean, Hollywood has changed so much, hasn't it? The industry is evolving. Younger voices are taking over. Surely even you can admit that your time has passed. Clint finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, like an old gunslinger who had been in this duel before. Darling, the thing about time is, it don't ask for permission. It just keeps moving. Whether I step aside or not, it's gonna do what it does. The audience chuckled. A few claps scattered through the room. Fiona, still smiling, waved her hand dismissively. Of course. But let's be honest, Clint. The world isn't the same as it was when you were making movies. Some of your films, while classics, have been criticized for being, well, let's just say, problematic. She turned toward the screen behind them. Let's take a look at one of your most famous roles. The lights dimmed slightly. The screen flickered on. A grainy black and white clip from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly played. Clint didn't flinch, but he knew exactly what was coming. Fiona had just set the trap, and she thought he was about to walk right into it. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the black and white footage flickered on the massive screen behind them. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. A lone cowboy, Clint himself, decades younger, stood in the middle of a dusty street, cigar clenched between his teeth, eyes sharp and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. A classic standoff, the tension, the silence, the inevitable moment where a man had to make a choice, shoot or be shot. Then, bang, gunfire echoed through the speakers as Clint's character took out an outlaw with one deadly shot. The scene cut to close-ups of his steely expression, the camera lingering on his cold, unflinching gaze. The audience chuckled as Fiona Sterling's voice dripped with mockery. Ladies and gentlemen, cinema at its peak, she announced, feigning admiration before dramatically placing a hand over her heart. A masterpiece of testosterone-fueled hero worship. The cowboy, the gunslinger, the legend. Because nothing says timeless storytelling like a white man solving his problems with a bullet, right? Laughter rippled through the audience. Clint remained perfectly still, his fingers loosely clasped together in his lap. His face betrayed nothing. Not amusement, not anger, just patience. Fiona smirked, sensing weakness. She wasn't done. Now, of course, some people might say, but Fiona, it's just a Western. She gave an exaggerated shrug. But let's be real. These movies didn't just entertain. They shaped a culture that glorified violence, toxic masculinity, and, let's be honest, a whole lot of outdated ideas. She turned to Clint, arching an eyebrow. Tell me, Clint, when you made these films, did it ever cross your mind? That you were, contributing to a problem? The audience leaned in, waiting. This was the moment. The trap had been laid. Clint finally moved. He let out a soft chuckle and tilted his head slightly. Then in a voice so calm and measured that it sent a ripple through the crowd, he asked, "You done yet?" Fiona blinked. The shift in the room was subtle but undeniable. The laughter died down. Even the studio crew, who had expected Clint to fumble through an outdated defense, watched with renewed curiosity. Fiona hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but Clint saw it. Then she smiled again. A predator's grin. "Not even close," she said smoothly, crossing her legs. She leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Now she was going for the kill. The silence that followed Fiona's smirk was thick, almost suffocating. The audience, once chuckling at her jabs, now sat on the edge of their seats. Some still expected Clint to fumble, to defend himself, to struggle against the weight of the modern era. But Clint Eastwood didn't defend. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, his eyes sharp and steady. Then, in that unmistakable, gravelly voice, he said, "You think I make men violent?" Fiona's smirk flickered for half a second, but she masked it with a tilted head and an amused expression. Clint didn't blink. "I tell stories," he continued, his voice calm, deliberate. "The world's been violent long before me, long before movies, long before cameras could capture it and give people like you something to talk about." The audience shifted. There was no laughter now. "You sit here in a studio, in a world built on war, built on revolutions, built on men who had to fight for every damn thing they had, and you think the problem started because I picked up a prop gun in a Western?" Fiona parted her lips slightly, not expecting this. "You act like Hollywood created violence," Clint continued. "That's cute. Violence has been around since men figured out they could take what they wanted with their fists. The only difference between then and now?" He gestured toward the camera. "Now folks like you get to talk about it on TV." A low murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded. Others sat frozen, eyes locked on Clint as if seeing him for the first time. Fiona straightened her posture, her grip tightening around the armrest. She had expected an old, outdated defense. Instead, Clint had flipped the entire argument on its head. But he wasn't done. "You want to talk about my movies?" Clint gestured toward the massive screen behind them, where the Western clip had frozen mid-frame. His younger self stood on the screen, revolver in hand. "You call this toxic?" Clint asked. "You ever read history, Miss Sterling? Ever hear about men who had to fight to survive, who didn't have the luxury of sitting in a chair under studio lights, sipping bottled water while they criticized the past?" Fiona forced a smile, but it was strained. "Clint, People didn't go to the movies to learn how to be violent," Clint continued, his voice unwavering. "They went because they already knew what violence was. They lived through it. They fought wars. They lost family. They came back home and needed to believe in something. Heroes, justice, standing your ground." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Maybe you don't like those stories. That's fine. But don't pretend they don't matter. And don't pretend that people like me are the problem. Because we both know you wouldn't be sitting here, making a career off controversy, if the world wasn't already broken." The room felt different now. Somewhere in the audience, a single person clapped, then another. Fiona's jaw tensed as she quickly looked toward her producers. She wasn't in control anymore. She had to regain the upper hand. Leaning forward, she interrupted, her voice sharper than before. "But what about your political views?" as she shot back. Clint slowly turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable. Now she was getting desperate. The tension in the studio was no longer just thick, it was palpable. Fiona Sterling had lost control of the conversation, and she knew it. Clint Eastwood wasn't defensive, wasn't scrambling for excuses. He was unshaken, unbothered. And worse, the audience was starting to agree with him. She couldn't let that happen. Fiona shifted in her chair, flashing a tight smile as she tapped her index finger on the desk, as if she were a teacher about to correct a misbehaving student. "You know, Clint," she said, her voice syrupy sweet but laced with condescension, "it's fascinating to hear you talk about history. But let's talk about the present. The world is changing. Society has evolved. And frankly, some people think that voices like yours," she paused dramatically, "aren't relevant anymore." Clint blinked once, then twice. Finally, he tilted his head slightly and let out a soft, amused chuckle. Fiona pounced on it. "See? Even you have to admit it. You have had a legendary career, but times are different now. Do you really think people still care about what you have to say?" the audience murmured. Some leaned in. Others shifted, sensing the shift in strategy. Clint exhaled slowly, then sat forward, resting his forearms on the desk between them. His voice was low, deliberate. "I don't think," he said. "I know." The room stilled. Fiona's confident smirk twitched. "And how do you know that?" she challenged, leaning forward slightly. Clint shrugged. "Because I walked into this room, and the first thing you did was try to prove I don't matter." The crowd let out a collective oof. Fiona clenched her jaw, visibly thrown off. That wasn't the answer she expected. She had set up the question to make him look outdated, irrelevant. Instead, he had turned it into proof of his influence. She needed to regain control, fast. Taking a breath, she adjusted the papers on her desk, masking her frustration with a polished smile. "Well," she said, her voice light but pointed, "if we're talking about proving things, let's go back a bit. I want to remind you, and our audience, of something you said before. Something that made headlines." She turned to the production team. "Roll the clip." The massive screen flickered to life once more. A past interview. Clint Eastwood, a younger version of himself, saying something that, in today's climate, would be considered highly controversial. The audience gasped. The setup was complete. Fiona turned back to Clint, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Care to explain?" she asked, sitting back as if she had already won. For the first time all night, Clint's face finally changed. Not in fear, not in anger, but something else. And the audience knew this wasn't over yet. The massive screen behind them flickered to life, casting a cold glow over the stage. A grainy black and white clip played. A younger Clint Eastwood sat in an old interview chair, his posture relaxed, a cigar dangling from his fingers. The audio crackled slightly as his voice filled the studio. "People these days are getting too damn sensitive. The world ain't fair, never was. And trying to make it fair? That's just a waste of time." The audience gasped. Fiona Sterling sat back in her chair, victorious. She had saved her best weapon for last, the final nail in the coffin. She turned to Clint, her expression carefully rehearsed, a mix of feigned disappointment and controlled superiority. "Clint," she said, her voice dripping with mock concern, "do you regret saying this?" The question hung in the air. The audience waited. This was the moment they had seen play out 100 times before. The guest stutters, scrambles, maybe even tries to reframe their words. But Clint just chuckled, a deep, genuine, belly-deep chuckle that sent a ripple through the room. Fiona's smile faltered. "Regret?" Clint finally said, shaking his head slightly. "Nah." The crowd shifted. Fiona blinked. "You're saying you stand by that statement?" Clint leaned back in his chair, resting an elbow on the armrest, completely at ease. "What I'm saying, sweetheart, is that I've learned, and learning's a hell of a lot better than pretending to be perfect, don't you think?" The audience murmured. A few nodded. Some even clapped. Fiona wasn't expecting that. She had set a trap, and somehow Clint had walked through it without a scratch. "So you're saying you've changed?" she pressed, trying to regain ground. Clint shrugged. "I'm saying a man's got two choices in life. He can either learn from the past, or he can waste time apologizing for it. I prefer the first option." A low ran through the audience. A few, "He's got a point," whispers could be heard. Fiona felt the moment slipping away. She had overreached. Clint hadn't crumbled. He hadn't begged for forgiveness. He had done something far worse. He had taken her weapon and turned it into a lesson. The producers in the control room were frantic. This wasn't how the segment was supposed to go. And for the first time all night, Fiona Sterling didn't have a response. The energy in the room had changed. At the beginning of the interview, the audience had been firmly on Fiona's side, laughing at her jabs, nodding along as she painted Clint as an outdated relic of Hollywood's past. But now they weren't so sure. A few heads in the audience tilted in thought. Some exchanged glances. A woman in the second row leaned forward, as if seeing Clint in a new light. Then from the back of the room, a single clap broke the silence. Then another. Fiona's spine stiffened. She had spent years perfecting her on-air persona. Sharp, poised, always in control. But for the first time she felt it slipping. She forced a tight smile, shifting slightly in her chair. "Clint, with all due respect," she said, her voice still carrying that polished TV charm, "this isn't about making you look small. This is about accountability, about understanding how media shapes society." Clint exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming lightly on the chair's armrest. Then with a calm, almost amused expression, he leaned in ever so slightly. His voice, steady as ever, cut through the air. "This was never about accountability. You came here to make me look small, but I don't have to play your game. A ripple of reaction moved through the audience. There was no laughter this time, no forced chuckles, just silence. And then, applause. It wasn't deafening, not yet, but it was growing. A man in the third row nodded firmly, clapping with conviction. A young woman near the aisle hesitated, then joined in. Others followed, their approval spreading in waves. Fiona's fingers clenched around her cue cards. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In the control room, her producers were panicking. "This isn't working," one muttered, eyes darting between monitors. The lead producer leaned toward the microphone connected to Fiona's earpiece, his voice tight. "We need to wrap this up," Fiona swallowed. The red light on the camera blinked, signaling that millions were watching. She had walked into this interview prepared to dismantle a legend. Instead, she had made him untouchable. The tension in the studio was at its breaking point. Fiona Sterling sat stiffly in her chair, her mind racing. This was supposed to be her moment. The interview where she outmaneuvered a legend and proved that Hollywood had moved past Clint Eastwood. Instead, she was losing ground. The audience, once eager to laugh at her jabs, was turning. Clint hadn't just survived her attacks. He had dismantled them with ease. And now, with time running out, she had one last chance to regain control. She took it. Forcing a smile, she adjusted the papers in front of her, as if casually preparing for the next segment. But her eyes flickered with something sharper, a final play. "Well, Clint," she began, voice smooth, "I have to say it's impressive. You've had a career most could only dream of, and you've held on to the spotlight for a long, long time." She glanced toward the audience, her grin widening, as if she had already won. "But don't you think," she said, pausing just enough to let the words land, "that maybe it's time for the old guard to step aside?" The room stilled. Fiona sat back, triumphant. She had backed him into a corner. Either he agreed, admitting he was irrelevant, or he fought back, which would only make him look defensive, desperate. Clint Eastwood did neither. Instead, he simply leaned forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, his fingers intertwined, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that shattered the space between them. And then, he spoke. "Respect isn't given, it's earned," he said, his voice low but powerful. A pause, then, the kill shot. "And kid, you ain't earned it." The world stopped. Fiona's smirk vanished. A sharp inhale rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock and awe. Even the camera crew, trained to remain professional, exchanged wide-eyed glances. In the control room, Fiona's lead producer froze. "Oh, hell," he muttered. On stage, Fiona's mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. Her confidence, her carefully crafted persona, all of it shattered in an instant. And then it happened. One clap, then another, then the flood. The audience erupted. Cheers, whistles, and a standing ovation. Some pounded their hands on the armrests. Others just stared at Clint with newfound respect. Fiona sat there motionless, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the desk. This wasn't just a loss. It was a reckoning. The applause was deafening. Fiona Sterling sat frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears as the studio audience rose to their feet. This was supposed to be her moment, the night she made headlines, the night she took down a legend. Instead, Clint Eastwood had just delivered a single cutting line that flipped the entire interview upside down. "Respect isn't given, it's earned. And kid, you ain't earned it." The words still hung in the air, still echoed in her mind. She forced a smile, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. "Well, Clint, that's certainly one way to look at it," she said, her voice strained. But the damage was done. The energy in the room had shifted. The crowd wasn't hers anymore. From the control room, her producer's voice crackled into her earpiece. "We're cutting to commercial. Now." The red light on the camera blinked off. The moment the show cut away, Fiona let out a sharp breath and turned to her producers, panic creeping into her voice. "We need to fix this," she hissed, but no one answered, because no one knew how. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood sat back in his chair, watching her with a knowing smirk, relaxed, unbothered. Then without a word, he stood. The room fell into an awkward hush as he tipped an imaginary hat toward the audience, the same way he had done in his westerns decades ago. The crowd went wild. He turned, walking off the stage without looking back. "Back stage," Fiona's lead producer shook his head. "You underestimated him," he muttered, rubbing his temple. Fiona didn't answer. She couldn't, because as she sat there, hands curled into fists beneath the desk, she heard it. The buzz of phones, notifications pinging from the audience, from the crew, Twitter, YouTube, every social media platform. exploding. And in that moment, she knew. She hadn't just lost an interview. She had become the story. The internet detonated within minutes. Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok. Every platform was flooded with clips of Clint Eastwood's devastating takedown. Shana Clint Eastwood owns Fiona shot to the top of trending, followed closely by Shine Respect Discerned and the more brutal Jarcha Fiona got wrecked. Someone had already uploaded a high-quality clip of the moment on YouTube. The title? Clint Eastwood humiliates arrogant host in live interview. Instant classic. Within an hour, it had over 2 million views. People loved it. This man is 94 years old and still dropping truth bombs. Fiona thought she was gonna gotcha Clint, but she got herself instead. He didn't just survive the trap, he dismantled it, set it on fire, and walked away like a cowboy into the sunset. Even celebrities started weighing in. A famous comedian tweeted, "Clint Eastwood is proof that if you stay calm and let people talk long enough, they'll embarrass themselves for you." Another Hollywood veteran chimed in, "Respect isn't given, it's earned." A lesson Fiona learned the hard way tonight. Meanwhile, Fiona Sterling was getting destroyed. Memes flooded the internet. One of her smiling confidently before the interview, side by side with a screenshot of her sitting in stunned silence as Clint delivered his knockout line. Caption, confidence versus reality. Another video, edited with dramatic music, zoomed in on Clint's unshaken face as Fiona tried desperately to regain control. The comment section was a slaughterhouse. She walked into that ring and got KO'd in the first round. Fiona tried so hard to be the smartest person in the room, but Clint didn't even break a sweat. This is a masterclass in keeping your cool. Somebody make this required watching. Fiona felt the damage in real time. She sat in her dressing room, hunched over her phone, scrolling through the disaster. Every second, more notifications popped up. More articles, more viral posts. Her name wasn't just trending, it was imploding. Her team scrambled. Damage control, PR strategies. A statement needed to be made fast. Finally, she took a breath and tweeted, "I respect different perspectives. Healthy debate is important for progress. Big mistake." The replies came instantly. "Ma'am, this wasn't a debate. You got humbled. Saying I respect different perspectives after you got embarrassed is crazy. This is the equivalent of, I'm sorry if you were offended. Just take the L and log off." The backlash only grew, and as Fiona watched her career spiral before her eyes, she realized something. She thought Clint was the one whose time had passed. She was wrong. The night air was cool as Clint Eastwood stepped out of the studio, his blazer resting lightly on his shoulders. The flashing lights of cameras and the frantic voices of reporters filled the air. But Clint moved unbothered, unrushed. "Mr. Eastwood, any comments on tonight's interview?" a reporter called, shoving a microphone toward him. Another one jumped in. "Do you think Fiona Sterling was unfair in her questioning?" Clint paused just before reaching his car, his weathered face illuminated by the flashing cameras. He didn't look annoyed, nor did he seem eager to respond. Instead, he let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Young people think they got it all figured out," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "Let them learn." The reporters erupted with more questions, their voices overlapping. "Would you ever go back on her show? What do you think of the backlash she's facing? Do you believe your movies are still relevant today?" Clint didn't answer. He simply gave a small nod, his hands tucked into his pockets as he stepped off the curb. The driver opened the door, and without another word, Clint slid into the car. The door shut, and just like that, he was gone. No grand speech, no retaliation, just a quiet, effortless exit. The kind only legends can pull off. Fiona Sterling sat alone in her dressing room, her back against the chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Her phone lay face up beside her, buzzing with notifications. Tweets, news articles, clips from the interview. She had stopped reading them. The damage was done. Instead, her eyes were locked on the television screen mounted on the wall. The replay of the interview was on loop. Her own voice echoed through the empty room. "Don't you think it's time for the old guard to step aside?" Then came Clint's answer. "Respect isn't given, it's earned. And kid, you ain't earned it." The audience's gasp, the applause. The moment she realized she had lost, her own face flashed on the screen, wide-eyed, stunned, powerless. She tore her gaze away from the TV and glanced toward the mirror across the room. Her reflection stared back at her, but something about it felt different. She had walked onto that stage believing this would be her defining moment. Instead, she had become a lesson, a warning to others about what happens when you underestimate the very people you try to destroy. The phone on the table buzzed again, louder this time. Outside, the world kept talking. Social media continued to tear her apart. News anchors debated whether this was a career-ending misstep. But inside that small, dimly lit dressing room, Fiona sat in silence. And for the first time, she realized she had lost more than just an argument.